So, Debbie, I sent you a voice memo earlier where I apologized for the whooshing of the large Halloween themed inflatables that I was passing in front of. That's apparently that's become my reality. We are all decked out for Halloween in a big way, in a big
Oh,
inflatable way. I can't wait
my
to see what my electricity bill looks like.
my children would be so jealous. I'm just a cheapskate, like, I just don't care. I'm not anti-inflatables. I just don't wanna spend money on it, and so I told my kids, though, told them, "They're expensive. Let's save money for Christmas decorations. We'll go big then." Well, of course, that gets misconstrued, and my daughter is in carpool with a mom, and they're all talking about the inflatables that they have at their house, and, of course, my daughter didn't tell me this, but I get a text from the mom being like, "Well, your daughter told me that you think inflatables are tacky." I was like, "Oh my goodness, that is not how I feel." You gotta be careful what you tell kids, because it's just even something
Oh
as simple
man.
as Halloween inflatables can be misconstrued into being pro or against. Heaven forbid you just, don't take a position on it. But I felt like that's kind
I
of like today's
mean,
episode. Traditional etiquette says that politics, religion, and money should never be brought up in polite company. And we're here to discuss all three. I'm Debbie Hancock, a conservative and a Christian living in the Deep South.
I'm Ariel Gorin, a born and raised New Yorker and a liberal Jew. We're asking the hard questions and actually listening to what the other has to say.
Is Anybody Listening podcast starts now. Last week, or I guess the last episode, apologies for the delay, we are moms with real lives, and sometimes sickness and all the things get us caught up. But we are here and we're really excited because last time we had a show, we mentioned that Trump was trying to negotiate a deal between Israel and Hamas, and it happened. So it's almost like we spoke it into existence. We record this podcast, we release it, and then we tease out clips in between. And I had to edit out some of it because it was already stale. But I guess that's the nature of a political podcast. But I am
That it is.
curious. Yeah. I want to go back a little bit to the beginning. We don't want to go too far back, but I do think Ariel has a tendency to think that everyone is as smart and well read as she is. And so let's give a little bit of background on what exactly happened and what is included in the deal and what is not.
Yeah. So I think it's important to pause and recognize that this is a really important moment, and particularly on the side of Israel for the families of these hostages who've been held captive for now almost 2 years, right? And there have been mass movements of people mobilizing in the streets, holding rallies, really pretty much every day since October
Hmm.
7th, 2023. It's just been a tremendous trauma that the entire country has dealt with. And so I don't want to in any way diminish how big a deal it is that the remaining hostages have come home, and that this fragile ceasefire or whatever it may be. Just yesterday, of course, Israel announced that they were going to launch strikes on Gaza. So who knows where we're going to head from here? But the fact that we've gotten to this point is a really big deal. But I will say, I think if you listen to President Trump, he's making peace in the region for the first time in 500 years or 3,000 years or whatever the hyperbole of the day is. And I think it's important to focus on what has actually happened and what is transacted here. So huge deal that the hostages are coming back. Equally enormous deal for so many Palestinian families who have had their family members imprisoned in Israel, oftentimes, if not always, with zero due process. So that is a huge deal. I think it's also important to recognize that right now, at least, this point that we're at looks very much like previous ceasefire deals. It's essentially a hostage swap, right? A prisoner swap. And so what happens next is really important because there is no plan yet for Hamas to disarm, even though that was sort of a key point. And I think it's worth mentioning that Hamas had agreed to the same terms of this deal about a year ago, but Israel refused to accept the deal because they said that Hamas hadn't yet been demolished. And now they're not saying that Hamas has been completely dismantled. So it's a little bit difficult to understand kind of what has changed other than the sort of realities on the ground, right? Which is public opinion. It's public opinion on the part of an exhausted and really saddened and traumatized nation on the part of Israel, of a completely just devastated and demolished Gaza, and massive sort of mobilization and turning points and everything that we've seen here in the US and the part of, our country, which is, I think everyone can agree, has just been Israel's biggest ally and supporter since the existence of the state of Israel. So it's complex, it's really deep, and I think there's just a lot more that needs to happen before we really understand how lasting this is and if it's really going to change the way forward, right?
Mhm. Well, I think you have a really interesting perspective on this growing up as a Jewish American, and it's one of the reasons why I wanna discuss it, and people that I told about this podcast, they were really excited to hear your perspective on this. So this is definitely gonna be an interview, more of an interview style podcast, less of a political debate. So I am curious, what was your experience growing up as a Jewish American? And I mean, culturally, socially, spiritually, politically. Take as much time as you need to talk about that.
I don't think that I have a particularly interesting family history. I think that everyone has a interesting family history, right? But my parents are immigrants to the US. They both grew up in Italy. There are Italian Jews, which for a long time, like a lot of people kind of scratch their heads when I mentioned that my parents were from Italy. And that changed a little bit with the movie Life is Beautiful. Then like people kind of started to understand. But there have been Jews in Italy since the Roman era. It's a very rich and interesting history I won't get into. But my parents both grew up in Italy. My dad's family, his parents were refugees from Eastern Europe who made their way to Italy sort of by happenstance after they left Romania at the end of World War II, and kind of settled for a time as refugees in Tel Aviv, in what was not yet the state of Israel, and then wound up in Italy, and where they were able to sort of, rebuild themselves and raise a family, and sort of be part of this Jewish community, this small Jewish community there. So my parents moved to New York just a little bit before I was born, arguably the most Jewish city on the planet. It is, in so many ways, kind of the like center of Jewish culture and thought, not just in the US, but in so many ways, even around the world, I think. And it's a special and like kind of wild place to, I think, grow up as a Jewish American, and just as a Jewish person in general, because there is something for everyone. Like you can find community in whatever type of Jewish life you want to lead, from being ultra religious to being completely secular. Like all of my friends, whether they are Jewish or not, or Black or white, or, Latino, Caribbean, whatever, like everyone peppers their everyday lexicon with Yiddishisms like tuchus or schlep. Like I had to schlep uptown, or I had to schlep to Brooklyn today, and like no one really thinks anything of it. It's just kind of like part of the culture here. And when I was growing up, at least it felt like a very safe place to grow up, I think, and a place where people could sort of bring their full Jewish identity to whatever they were doing. And, I think that that's changed a little bit everywhere, but I tend to have a view that that's something that kind of unfortunately rears its ugly head whenever there is conflict, whenever Israel has conflict in the region, and that it kind of like ebbs and flows.
I have a question about, you said you felt fairly safe. Was there ever conversation of certain parts of the country aren't safe, or is that kind of a universal, in America you felt safe?
I think in America, we felt safe. And I think, in meeting people, I didn't obviously like, until you grow up, you leave, whatever, your world is pretty small. But it was really for me in going to college and after college that I met people who maybe grew up in places around the country where there just wasn't, as nowhere has as significant as the Jewish community, but maybe was outside New York or LA or Miami or New Jersey, that like I even had any awareness that they had, swastikas painted on their lockers or things like that. Like I had no sense that that was even possible,
Mhm.
until I was much older. But I think, every Jewish person you talk to inevitably sort of has that experience of encountering someone, and whether it's, just sort of ignorance or like a lack of knowledge or outright anti-Semitism, I think sooner or later, everyone sort of has that experience. Unfortunately for one of my kids, it was in kindergarten that he came home and said to
Mhm.
me, oh, there's a kid who he just like really admired and loved hanging out with. And he was said, this friend told me that his mom really wouldn't like us hanging out because I'm Jewish.
Mm-mm.
And that just like completely broke my
Ugh.
heart. It was also really complicated because um, I had met the mom. She was always so nice to me and was always, we ended up leaving because we moved, was very like, her son like gave him a book that he knew that Oliver was into, and so it just didn't like track with what I knew. And so you have to
Mhm.
think, do kids sometimes absorb things like the way we started off the podcast, like things can get misconstrued. So
Right.
I didn't want to make anything of it, but it's
Yeah.
hard to know, like, when is the right moment to make something of it? When is it a
Yeah.
teachable moment? When do you let it slide? These things are really complicated.
Well, you said you're not special because you are, one in a million or whatever in New York. But my husband told me not to admit this because he thought it was embarrassing, but you thought it was funny. I mean, I didn't know anybody that was Jewish growing up. And I lived in a diverse area, but it was diverse with Hispanics. And as you're talking, I'm thinking there was also a huge German population
Mhm.
near where I was. So maybe that has something to do with it. But all that to say, my exposure to Jewish culture growing up was Adam Sandler's and the OC,
Yeah.
and they had Chrismukkah,
Oh, yeah.
and it wasn't.
Chrismukkah, that's a big one.
Yeah, yeah. It wasn't until I moved to DC and was working in politics that I interacted with the Jewish culture, and that was on the conservative side. And so for a
Hmm.
while, I believed that Jewish people were mostly conservative. And this is a question I've had a lot of people ask, and they're genuinely curious. Well, one, I'd love to know. I assume that most of the people that you grew up around shared your liberal beliefs. And I'm curious why that is. What do you think it is about your culture that lends itself more to the Democratic Party?
It's a great question. And of course, I think like anyone else, right? No group is monolithic. And it's worth noting a couple things. So one is that if you look, I'll cite because it's the one that I know off the top of my head. But if you look at, for example, the 2008 election, it was like 95% of Black American voters swung for Barack Obama. And the next sort of ethnic group that we account for after that was, I think, above 78% of
Mm,
American Jews voted for Barack Obama. So it was like the most ardent support that he could count on was in that election was on American Jews. And those numbers have held across a number of elections. Obviously, we've seen some change and we'll talk about that more. But it's really interesting, right? A couple things that are of note. One is that I think, and as you've seen and sort of alluded to, but Jewish Americans who tend to be more religious, who are more Orthodox, tend to be more politically conservative. Jewish Americans who consider themselves to be more in the reform or secular mold, they tend to be more liberal. And what's really interesting is that I thought about
like the
this a little
rest
bit
of the
for
country.
myself. Like, yeah. And I thought about this sort of in my own world and then also did some reading on it. And what's really interesting is that for more secular or more less observant, let's say Jews who are maybe in the reform movement, grew up in the reform movement, or what's called somewhat paradoxically for the purposes of this podcast, but the conservative movement, but that's not like sort of a more religious sect. These are people who, just to give you a sense, like probably don't keep a kosher home, don't observe Shabbat. So they'll like, drive or work or whatever on Saturday. So these are people who are observing the holidays, but in a more modern way, let's say.
Mhm.
So they tend to see their liberalism, if you will, as being really aligned with their Jewish values. So there's a concept in Judaism of tikkun olam, which means repairing the world. And there's strong concepts of justice, which for a lot of liberal American Jews is sort of interpreted to be like the fight for civil rights and social justice. And so they really see their political values as super aligned with their religion. But what's interesting is that for more observant Jews, right, who practice more, who sort of adhere to some of the stricter rules about, dietary laws and things like that, observing Shabbat, they tend to vote more conservative, which is interesting, right?
Mm.
Because there is less of this sort of religious justification for what they believe. But I think, like a lot of things, it is wrapped up in some ways in identity, but it's also fundamentally, I think it's about security. And that's also what we
Mm.
see in Israel, where there have been so many cleavage points over the past, what is it? I can do the math, but since 1948, however long Israel has been in existence, there's all these cleavage points in society there. And a lot of them, especially these days, are among sort of the more modern or secular Jews and the ultra Orthodox. And it's become a real sticking point politically and really sort of I guess, a fight for the future, not just in terms of making peace with Palestinians and with other neighbors, but really for kind of what Israel wants to be and what
Hmm.
it's going to look like.
That's very interesting. Going back to the current events, I think many people, myself included, have seen this conflict play out on the periphery and perhaps wrongfully distilled this, as my daughter did, as a false dichotomy of being pro Israel or pro Palestine. And someone asked me as much when I mentioned we were going to be discussing this. They asked, where do you fall? So, do you believe that this is an oversimplified false choice? And if so, why?
Yeah, I 100% believe that it's an oversimplified false choice.
I
So
led the witness there.
thank you for the softball question, Debbie. Look, I think this is this is not new in a lot of ways, right? For those of us who are sort of like old enough to remember, I have very, very strong memories of the beginning of the Second Intifada, which was around 2000, which was, this uprising. There were a lot of terrorist attacks all over Israel, sort of bombings and stabbings. And, I remember hearing from more politically conservative Jews who we knew who were saying, that this is a problem that needs to be dealt with, that Palestinians are not a real people, that that nobody has been kicked out of their homes or off their land. Things that just really struck me, even as a really young person, as strange and not true. And so it doesn't surprise me that now, when on top of that, we have social media and all these things that are sort of, as we've seen time and again, dividing us and like amplifying the loudest voices in the room, that people have a lot of trouble seeing nuance and finding some kind of in between or gray space in this conflict, right? And so I don't think it's at all at odds to be able to say that, we might believe in Israel's right to defend itself and to exist, but that we also believe that Palestinians have a right to exist and have a right to not be living in an occupied state, and to have everyday freedoms and basic rights. I don't see those things as a conflict at all. Of course, it is all very, very complex and very nuanced. And I listened to Ezra Klein's most recent podcast, where he had this Israeli journalist on named Amit Segal, he and I would not agree on a lot of things, but I think he's very politically adroit. And so he has some very astute observations. And he said that one of the conflicts that we saw recently over the judicial reforms in Israel, so this was just before October 7th, not to get too deep into politics there internally, but there were massive, massive protests for almost every day for over a year, because Prime Minister Netanyahu was essentially trying to consolidate power under the prime ministership and take powers away from the judiciary. Sound familiar? And so there was this massive uprising, this protest. And so this Israeli journalist, Amit Siegel, says, this really wasn't about the judicial reforms. It was about this idea of whether Israel is going to be more Jewish than it is democratic, or more democratic than it is Jewish. And I would actually say that tension goes back a lot further than just the judicial reforms. We're actually, next week, I think, will be the 30th anniversary of the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, who was Israeli prime minister who first tried to make peace at the first Oslo Accords. And again, for a lot of people who are new to this, because this is the first time that this conflict has really been at the forefront in their lifetimes, or just the first time they've really been paying attention, Yitzhak Rabin was not assassinated by a Palestinian terror group. He was assassinated by an Israeli right-wing ultranationalist who did not want peace, right? And that's an important part of the story as well. So, I think there's a lot of people in Israel, there's a lot of American Jews who are seeing this all unfold and are sort of wondering, what does the future of Israel look like? Because when you've seen the internal politics and the way that is then manifested in the sort of security policy track, really hawkish and really security heavy. And then, of course, there's this added dimension of Netanyahu looking to consolidate power and stay in power because he has been under indictment. It all forms this very complicated picture of what this looks like, and what has to do with sort of actually protecting people, and what has to do with sort of playing politics. So I probably answered 17 questions other than just the one you just asked me, but
No, you answered it just very thoroughly.
very thoroughly.
You mentioned that a lot of people are just now really paying attention, and we'll get into this a little bit later about social media, but I was scrolling through social media and I came across this panel discussion with Bill Clinton. I think it was from earlier this summer. And I found it very interesting just because I was unaware, I guess, of some of his history on this. We were smaller children when it happened. So I'm gonna play this clip.
I tell the young people, for example, who are understandably in America, or let's say they're super sympathetic with the Palestinians. Well, they've been killed. A lot of those Palestinians have, and all they know is that a lot more Palestinians have been killed than Israelis. And I tell them what Arafat walked away from. And they can't believe it. I said, oh yeah, he walked away from a Palestinian state with a capital in East Jerusalem, 96% of the West Bank, 4% of Israel to make up for the 4% that the settlers occupy that were beyond the borders in the 67 war. And I go through all the stuff that was in the deal, and they it's not on their radar screen. They can't even imagine.
I'm curious, what is your take on this?
Yeah, I think that that has been certainly a common refrain. Um, and it's not something that I fundamentally disagree with, but I think it's also there's a lot of truths on on the other side of the coin, if you will, right? I think that there's a very strong argument to be made that Netanyahu also does not want peace and that he does not personally benefit from that. Right. There's many Israelis, I think, not just the sort of the leftist Israelis or the people who are sort of oftentimes derided as being, just pro peace and would just give everything away or, let themselves be like annihilated or whatever, which is, how I think their arguments are often framed. But I think that there's a lot of concern about, whether or not this current administration there has the ability to be a good faith actor given everything that's been going on.
I think there is a lot of belief that Netanyahu would like this war to continue because once it's over, he will lose a lot of power, whether it's in the bribery cases or just being able to hold the legislative body in power and kind of dictate things. So I don't think that is a perspective that is just held by your side. I've definitely heard that on the right as well. One of the reasons why I wanted to talk about this, Ariel actually wanted to discuss another issue this week, but the reason why this really caught my attention, I wish I could say I was a policy wonk on this. I clearly am not, but I thought it was interesting because I don't know if this speaks volumes of my cynicism or just the reality of America's partisan politics. But in journalism, there's an old saying that dog bites man is not a headline, but man bites dog is a headline. And so a headline about disrest between Israel and the Palestinian people is not a headline. But what was an interesting headline to me was when I saw that Hillary Clinton, Chuck Schumer, Bill Clinton, Governor Josh Shapiro, and Rahm Emanuel, just to name a few, were praising not just the deal, but Trump's role in facilitating it. Notably quiet was President Obama, and I was especially interested in this because when he called George Bush to share that bin Laden had been assassinated, George Bush, Cheney, Condoleezza Rice, Rumsfeld, some individuals that Obama had been highly critical of, praised Obama's role in this. So what do you make of, I guess, the diversity of people giving credit versus not giving credit?
Yeah. So I think it's really complicated. And I keep saying that so much. I keep going out. It's really complicated. It's all
That's
really
going to be
complicated.
the name of the show. It's complicated.
It's complicated. Yeah. I think that so it's no secret that right now there is a perception that there is a rift in the Democratic Party that is somewhat generational over Israel, right? And over what happened, predominantly over what happened in Gaza, but also that there are increasingly more and more younger Americans who are willing to call themselves anti-Zionist openly, whether they're Jewish or not. This is a big change from where the Democratic Party has been for decades, right? And I think that Barack Obama was a little bit of a turning point. And I think a lot of this goes back to the Iran nuclear deal. A lot of it goes back to Obama telling Netanyahu outright that he was not going to support the building of more settlements in the West Bank, whereas other, even Democratic presidents, kind of like just like wink and a nod, we're going to ignore this for now. It wasn't until I think last year, 2024, that the Biden administration came out and said, oh, actually, yeah, these settlements are illegal under international laws. I think that Netanyahu's relationship with Obama, was always very much on the rocks, and that's something, probably a million reasons we could discuss why. Whereas Biden was viewed as sort of this more like the Clintons viewed as sort of these more like normie Democrats who traditionally just support Israel. And so I think that has a good deal to do with it. And my guess would be that President Obama probably didn't say anything because he was worried about how that might be perceived, because his administration was really the first Democratic administration to be seen as maybe shifting policy on sort of the decades and decades of the U.S. just sort of, just like no questions asked support of Israel. And I think it's worth noting here that, that has indeed been the case, right? So I pulled up some numbers. Israel and the U.S. do not have a mutual defense pact like the U.S. has with Japan, or of course with NATO, for however much longer that might last. We'll see. But Israel has been, couldn't get away with not making a snarky comment on that. But Israel has been the largest cumulative recipient of U.S. foreign aid since its founding. It has received over $300 billion in total economic and military assistance from the U.S. And so that dwarfs everyone else. It's worth noting that the U.S. has also provided significant resources to other countries in the region, particularly Egypt and, of course, Iraq, but Israel really stands out. And since October 7th, 2023, the U.S. has provided $16.3 billion in direct military aid to Israel. So, I think we can understand why there's a lot of questions being asked, right? And there's obviously there's a lot that can be unpacked about how and when criticism of Israel crosses the line into being anti-Semitic. It's really, I think it's tough, and it's something that a lot of people are wrestling with. But I also think that sometimes people have an inability to sort of zoom out and see this in like a way that is empathetic in 360 degrees. And there's reasons for that, right? It's like a third of American Jews have relatives in Israel. 2/3 say that they feel an emotional attachment to Israel. That's something that has been like deeply a part of kind of synagogue culture, Hebrew school culture across all denominations and like levels of religiosity. And, of course, in the US, I think it's like numbers vary, but between 10 and 20% of Jewish Americans are descended from Holocaust survivors, whereas in the state of Israel, 50% of Israelis are descended from Holocaust survivors. And also worth noting that for those who are not descended from European Jews, that the vast majority of the rest of them either come from the former Soviet Union, where, of course, they were, essentially repressed, right? You couldn't practice any religion, or from the rest of the Middle East and North Africa, where they were, through sort of the post-colonial era, just like systematically booted from the country. A lot of people, there's a lot of stories of people who barely escaped with their lives from Egypt, from Libya, from Iraq, from Iran, from all over the Middle East. And that's something that's kind of forgotten a lot of times, I think, when you hear these debates back and forth in the US. And it's frustrating to me as someone who like tries to see the nuance and tries to see the detail and everything, because I think that on one side, when you hear people say like Israelis are colonialist settlers who need to go back to Europe, like go back to Poland or whatever, and then people on the other side are not hearing themselves when they're saying, that Palestinians, don't deserve to be here, and like they could just go live in Egypt or in Jordan or something like that. And like people don't really seem to like understand the hypocrisy there. So
They're
I think
also
that's
not welcome there, largely.
Right, exactly. And like, why would anyone want to go live somewhere that's not their home? So it's hard to be hopeful, but I tend to think that like, we cannot truly ever have real peace and security in Israel without the peace and security of the Palestinian people. I just don't think that that's going to be the case. Otherwise, we're just going to move forward in this like highly militarized fortified borders and whatever. And that's not even addressing things like the right to return, which is super important to Palestinians. The fact that nobody really understands how you could have a Gaza and a West Bank as part of the same country that are in no way connected, right? And then, of course, there's the big question over control of Jerusalem. So I just think like we need to all be a little bit more realistic that you've got 7 point some million Israeli Jews, you've got million Palestinians and Arab Israelis within the country, in the Gaza Strip, in West Bank, some who are, fully citizens of Israel, but sort of on paper only. We have to find a way to live together. Nobody is going, or they have to find a way to live together. You're not going to like mass deport either of these people. It's the only way forward. But I think a lot of people really get caught up in sort of this, who has the right and who started it and who is to blame. And until we find some leadership that's brave enough to move beyond that, it's hard to think that things will ever change.
I have to circle back to the comment about the military aid because I think I would get
Yeah.
yelled at if I didn't. I don't think it's any any secret that Israel is a critical ally for the U.S. I mean, setting aside the topic of the day, Israel is geographically located in a very unstable area, and they have been known to be a stabilizing force. And so obviously, we share economic interests, military interests, and intelligence sharing. And so they are a critical ally in our fight against mutual adversaries. So I just wanted to make that point as far as, yes, we do give a lot of military aid, but it benefits the U.S. greatly in our efforts to promote peace in that unstable region.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, and that's an important point. It's also worth noting that some journalists and some scholars have pointed to this, that October 7th, none of these things happen in a vacuum. And when did October 7th happen? It happened just as I believe we were like a couple days from the Abraham Accords going into effect, right? And so the normalization of relationships for Israel with other countries in the region, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, that is seen as very threatening to terror groups and to state-sponsored terror, right? Like Iran is the backer of Hezbollah, and a number of these groups, whether it's, Islamist Jihad, Hamas, can like link a lot of their money back to Qatar, back to Iran. So the idea, right, that like we could find common ground on trade, on tourism, on things like that is very, very threatening to terrorists, right? And so I think there needs to be some understanding of a plan for the region and like greater cooperation in the region. What scares me a bit is that, and we can understand why, because anytime anyone feels under threat or under attack, I think there's this sort of like innate human nature to sort of turn inward. But I was actually talking last week to a professor of Middle Eastern studies at a major Israeli university, and he mentioned a statistic that totally shocked me, which is that fewer than 4% of Jewish Israelis can read a book in Arabic. And there's been big political fights there's sort of like big politicization around the language. Arabic used to be an official language of Israel, and it was removed, I think, in 2017 or 2018.
Also not unique to that region.
Right. But, when you try to right, exactly. When you try to sort of divorce it from the politics, it would just seem that that's kind of a dumb move, right? Like you're surrounded by 400 million Arabic speakers, even just from a question of like just baseline, like security for the nation, being able to effectively conduct intelligence, being able to one day hopefully trade with more partners in the region. For so many reasons, that strikes me as so short-sighted. But that is, again, it's been like weaponized and become a political discussion as Israel has sort of continued down this path of becoming more hawkish, more right-wing, and in appeasing, a more religious kind of ultranationalist audience, right? In the form of these sort of more right-wing political parties. It's different from here. Obviously, we could like nerd out about how the parliamentary system works, and it
You
is
could.
not.
I can't.
Come on, you didn't love comparative politics in college, but it's worth noting that it's not a large swath of the population that supports these sort of more right-wing parties, but like they are in power, they're in parliament because Netanyahu needs them for his coalition. And, these are members of parliament who are bringing forth proposals to like shut down mass transit on Shabbat, on the Sabbath, on Saturdays, or like, gender segregate buses, right? So in the same way that like don't support the Taliban in control of Afghanistan, and in the same way that like I personally would not like to see like Oklahoma become a Christian state, like I
Too
think that
late.
it's a exactly. Yeah. But like I just think that this is something that has to be dealt with, right? We're inching towards theocracy. We've been inching towards theocracy there, I think, or at least accommodating it in a dangerous way.
Okay, this wasn't on the list of questions. So
Surprise question. Uh-oh, I'm scared.
well, no, you just mentioned it, and I do think I know people are gonna wonder this, and we don't have to talk about it at length, but you mentioned Iran, and so I'm curious
Mhm.
what your opinion was on Israel's actions against them.
Mm. Well, I don't know. I don't know that I have an opinion on it. I think it's tough for us to think about because we don't sort of live under constant threat, but I think it's also hard to justify strikes against other nations. And then you have the added complexity of, this is a theocracy where I think a lot of us personally would really like to see regime change, but it's hard to do without tremendous casualties, right? It's hard to see that happening. But in such a repressive regime, it's also, it's hard to know what's right and wrong. I think in those situations, it really is. I think that it does seem to have provided some kind of deterrence. So in that sense, it was probably a move in the right direction. But I think it's always really difficult to know kind of in the moment or in the immediate aftermath if it was the right move or not.
Hmm.
I think time will tell.
My take on it is that it was good. I think
Yeah.
nobody wants to see Iran have a bomb. We
Yeah.
don't know what actual damage was done, but I think that's actually an area we can get on board with China, Saudi, the Gulf
Mhm.
states. But that's my perspective. I was curious what yours was.
Yeah. I mean, look, I think to the extent that it did not grow into a greater conflict, sure. Yes. At the time, I think I was a bit more afraid that, okay, like this is going to be the beginning of World War III.
Hmm. Yeah, for sure. Okay, we talked about this a little bit, just kind of Netanyahu's motivation, but you sent me an article by Thomas Friedman, which I really enjoyed.
Hmm.
I thought his perspective was very interesting. And what I really like is he didn't just take the first half, I thought, I agree, I agree, I agree. In the second half, I was a little bit more hesitant, but I will say that's the sort of writer I appreciate. I don't want to
Hmm.
just agree with someone on everything or disagree. To me, that's not very thoughtful. But there was one thing in his article that I thought stood out, and I agreed with it completely. He wrote, whenever U.S. presidents, particularly Democrats, tried to press Prime Minister Netanyahu to enter into peace negotiations, the prime minister could always run to evangelical Christians, to Republicans basically, and use them as a lever to neutralize the White House and to deflate any pressure on Israel. But under Trump, that's not possible because he completely controls his party now. And so Netanyahu found himself forced to enter into these negotiations very grudgingly. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really astute observation. My takeaway in sort of watching how this all unfolded had been that Trump had probably kind of like, in a way, almost out Netanyahu, and that he probably got Netanyahu to agree to it by Netanyahu thinking that Hamas would never agree to it. Right. That he could say, well, I agreed to it and they said no. And then it just didn't happen. So I think that's part of it. And I also think that from other things that I read and kind of insidery things that, that kind of getting him like on the phone and getting him to apologize to Qatar for the strikes there, that was a really important turning point. I don't know that any other president necessarily would have had kind of like the leverage over him to do that. So, I think you got to respect that. And I think that's why, to what you said before, um, it's probably why you had a whole bunch of Democrats praising him, right? And just hoping that it would hold. I think that had to do a lot with why they decided to come out and say it, is that like if everyone sort of in agreement and praising him, and we all know how much he loves to have his ego stroked, right? That like maybe we'll see more of this.
Yeah. I mean, I think there are certainly cases where a negative can be used as a positive. I think one of the most savvy moves that two of the most savvy moves that Donald Trump has done has been early on to position himself at his own words were that he's the most pro-life president in US history. There's been a lot of
Right.
questions about how one measures that and why
Yeah.
he thinks he's been more pro-life than others. But the other was early on coming out and recognizing Jerusalem as the capital. And I think after that, he basically was able to garner unwavering support from especially evangelicals. And so while I think that is fraught with a lot of issues, in this case, it was actually helpful. Backing up a little bit, you were just talking about Democrats lauding President Trump on this. And this quote stood out to me, again, similar to Man Bites Dog. When I see Rahm Emanuel praising President Trump, my ears perk and I'm, curious what's going on. But he told the New York Times, if you want to get heard on your criticism, you give a compliment and then you'll be heard on the criticism loud and clear. If all you are is a critic, it's harder to be heard. And I think that this is so true, not just in politicians that need to work with President Trump. I mean, I'll say my initial reaction to seeing Hillary Clinton praise Trump was, oh, is she going to run again? But he's right. And I think if that is her motivation, maybe it's not, but if that is her motivation, I think she is also smart to do that, because I know I personally stopped watching the news about a year into the Trump administration because I already knew that whatever Trump was doing, CNN was going to say it was the worst thing ever. And Fox News was going to defend whatever he said. And to me, it was just a waste of time. And I tuned it out, which is so dangerous
Yep.
and scary. I mean, we don't want a nation that is tuning out the media. That is, a tenet of our freedom. My personal belief in whether or not he deserves credit for this, I think returning the hostages alone is worthy of praise. I am actually standing with Senator Durbin in saying, let's not wave the mission accomplished banner just yet on peace. But I think you could praise him simply for returning those hostages. That is certainly worthy of
Absolutely.
attention. Another thing that Rahm Emanuel has said recently that caught my attention, I believe this was on C-SPAN with Mike Pence. He said the
I
United
feel like you're becoming a real Rom fangirl,
Yeah,
Debbie.
I know. It probably sounds like I read one article, but I mean, it was at all these different places that he was standing
Huh.
out to me.
It's popping
Who
up
knows?
everywhere.
I know. It's gonna be like, what is this single white female that she has? No, he was reacting to the ceasefire, and he said the United States is the essential power around the world. We shouldn't back off from that responsibility, and we just proved this in spades. Something that neither Russia, China, or any other country could have done what we just did. And that's a good for the US. And that means power does not stay in the region. It exudes and goes into other regions. I thought this was really interesting, and I was wondering what, if any, role you think America should play in negotiating between these two groups, and how this particular intervention might differ from other conflicts America has thrust itself into in the recent past, with the war in Ukraine, the war on terror, and how this perspective might differ from the mainstream Democrats.
Yeah, that's a great question. Think that it is in the same way that we talked about how Trump was kind of uniquely positioned to have this leverage with Netanyahu. I think that historically it has been tough for the US to perhaps be taken seriously with the Palestinian Authority or with whoever Israel might be negotiating against, because the US is just seen as so intertwined and such an essential ally of Israel, right? And I think that that has been a tricky spot to be in. I think that in the same way that a number of the Middle East partners were able to sort of put pressure on the Palestinian Authority, and they're now putting pressure, hopefully, if things continue, to help dismantle Hamas, that the U.S. and other allies of the U.S. need to also sort of play a role in reevaluating what this support for Israel looks like moving forward. I say this because I think that there is a real shift in the U.S. that is not just within the Democratic Party, but I think you also see it among lots of conservatives, that a lot of what Israel did in this war was absolutely unacceptable. And that people might disagree on whether or not it was right to go into Gaza, but that what was done there and the loss of life among innocents and among children is just absolutely unacceptable. And so I think that there has to be some kind of awareness that there needs to be change and that there needs to be sort of a plan for the region, as we were alluding to before, with potential expansion of normalizations with other partners in the region, and that there needs to be some kind of concessions made on the part of Israel as well. Because right now, again, what we saw is that the prisoners in Israel were released, the hostages were returned, but that looks a lot like past agreements. And if Hamas is to disarm, it's going to take more people, more states in the international community to ensure that that happens. And that there also has to be some effort at rebuilding a life for Gaza, for people who have remained there. I mean, they're talking about generations of people who have dealt with just unthinkable suppression of human rights and any sort of ability to live a normal life, to live in a normal economy. And I think it's going to take not just the leadership of the US, but the leadership of the rest of the world to move forward to a place where that can happen. And, I think that it's not going to be fast and it's not going to be easy, right? There's a whole sort of, a lot of people will sort of cynically say that anytime Israel goes to war, not cynically, but I think it's actually really smart that anytime Israel goes to war, that it's creating a whole new generation of terrorists, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there has to be some understanding of that, and there has to be some effort to combat that, because you're talking about families that have been devastated, so many refugees, I've lost count, people who have seen their children die of starvation, kids who've lost their parents. I mean, it's just absolutely awful.
Yeah.
And there has to be some kind of effort to do something about that, right? It's just, I don't see a way forward unless everyone says that we need to do something to invest in this place.
Emmanuel's quote stood out to me, or comments, because it really is, I feel like the conservatives and liberals have kind of switched places, where, with the exception of Israel, have really become isolationist. And I very much, to quote George Bush, quoting the Bible, believe to whom much is given, much is expected. And I know Rahm Emanuel would never voice as much, but his remarks to me sounded an awful lot like one of the tenets of the Bush doctrine, that spreading democracy and freedom is a key component to fighting terrorism. But I think...
Yes, or for Spider-Man fans, with great power comes great responsibility.
Yeah.
It's ostensibly the same thing,
Now, there's something we can all, Bush doctrine, that is lightning rod word that I love to use. Spider-Man is probably better savvy communications, though. Who can argue with that? But I think the populist Republicans these days, which control most of the party, would prefer to wash their hands of most international disputes. But I think by staying out of this, and it sounds like you believe the same thing, the Palestinians will only be further harmed. Even with all of our imperfections, America still adheres to these human rights values in the Geneva Convention, and we go out of our way to protect civilians and help rebuild. And it's one of the reasons why the war on terror took so long, but it's dangerous and it's expensive and it's slow. So it kind of explains why it's usually a path that is preferred to be avoided, and it's often very politically unpopular.
It is. And I think also worth noting that we can't ignore the soft power aspect of it as well. And I fear for this world that we live in, where we've essentially dismantled USAID, say what you want about it. But these are things that make a difference in people's lives, right? And affect the way people perceive the United States. And, if we are building wells for clean water in places that need it, or we're providing textbooks, or bringing teachers in through the Peace Corps, whatever it might be, providing retroviral drugs, again, through PEPFAR, all of these things make a difference. And like you said, they are long-term. They are not quick fixes. They take time, but they are so critical, especially in places where people are vulnerable to extremism and to terrorism, because they are under-resourced and because they don't have a lot of opportunity. And so until we address that, I think that those programs remain so important. And the fact that this administration has cut back so severely on them is something that I fear a lot and that I hope won't have dire consequences, 10, 20 years down the line. But I worry about that a lot.
For sure. Well, one of the things that made this very difficult to prepare for was just the bias in media sources. And so when I was
Mhm.
talking to different people, reading different news outlets and accounts, you don't just get wildly different opinions, you get very different facts. And I think it's one of the reasons why a lot of times with international issues, I stay a little bit more neutral because I'm not there. I
Yeah.
don't know what's going on. I have to listen to one side or the other. And again, it's not just the opinions that vary, it's the facts that are presented. And it kind of made me wonder, I mean, what do you look to? What is a source that you have found? When I talk to you, I don't hear one side or the other. And again, this is why I wanted to talk to you about it because you have a very unique perspective. I know you don't think it is, but it is.
Yeah. I mean, I try to, you know, read sort of the internationally most heralded sources on this stuff. But even then, sometimes there will be Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington, whatever folks, or even internationally, The Guardian, whatever. I'll sometimes read Haaretz in English, which is essentially like a left leaning paper out of Israel that has an English version. It's hard, and I think it's made a lot harder by the fact that I personally believe that both the Israeli government and Hamas have very effective propaganda machines,
Correct. Yeah.
probably equally effective propaganda machines because they know their audiences.
Mhm.
And then again, as we were saying before, you throw social media into the mix, and it's an absolute powder keg. And I think that's also, in all likelihood, sort of why we saw the reactions that we saw out of young people, why we saw the campus protests, is that people are hungry for something to care about. I think too, kind of coming out of COVID and that experience, and there's not a whole lot of effort to look at this sort of with 360-degree perspective, 360-degree empathy, particularly for kids who, as we know, are getting all of their news from social media,
Mhm.
not bothering to read a full-length article because they probably don't have the attention span to. And it's a real problem. It's a real problem.
Yeah. It's interesting. You hear a lot about fake news, and something that I've
Yep.
tried to share with people is I've worked with the media for over 20 years now, and I believe and I have experience of very biased media, whether that is the tone of the questions that are being asked. As a
Huh?
conservative press secretary, we're always responding on the defense. Whether it's what they choose to write about and focus on
Yeah,
or not write about.
absolutely. Or not write about.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah.
The op-eds that they will accept or not accept, I have
Mhm.
found that actually, when I was working on the Dobbs case, every single national outlet ran an op-ed from the attorney general who was arguing the case, except for the New York Times, and we went to them over and over again, and to me,
Mhm.
that was a bias of not presenting our side. But this is a very long-winded way of saying, while I have seen bias in the American media, I can count on one, maybe two hands, but not even full hands, the number of times I've had to demand a correction for something that is
Mm.
blatantly false. And so I think people overestimate the fake news, if you will. But as someone that has worked with the media that has not been friendly to me, I still can say, they have a commitment to truth, even if it's
Yeah.
slanted. And that is something that has been hard in reading other sources, international sources. I did find the BBC to be very helpful and very straightforward, which surprised me a little bit, actually.
Yeah, I like their coverage too. I think it's also really a good thing to note is that generally covering war is very difficult, right? It's
Sure.
really challenging, and so some of that is understandable. There's going to be misinformation, there's going to be information that is not easily accessible, and as we see conflict, violent conflict play out in the modern era, right? Like first it was the 24-hour news cycle, then it was online news, then it was social media news, right? There's even more challenges, right? Because there's this expectation on journalists that they're going to get it absolutely right the first time. And that
Mhm.
is just not going to happen in a
Mhm.
war zone, right? So I
Yeah.
think that's a really important note too.
And I think it's good for people to ask questions. I mean, don't just accept the first thing that you hear. Dig into a
Yeah.
little bit. look at other sources, see how it lines up. I also think you said it last week, and this phrase or this concept has stuck with me, like, 2 things can be right at the same time or true at the same time, and I asked this question earlier about how it's been oversimplified into pro-Israel or pro-Palestinian. You can empathize with the Palestinian people that have gone through this and still say, yes, Israel has a right to defend their borders. It doesn't have to be one or the other. And I think if you are hearing sources that are making it that black and white, that's probably a red flag that maybe this is not, the most unbiased news source, and not to believe everything you hear. And I'm not saying everything they put out is wrong, but I think reading a lot of different sources is super helpful.
Absolutely. That's 100% right. And I think, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but there have been many, many polls that have shown that, the vast majority of Palestinians want peace, want not just this current iteration of the conflict to end, but, don't want to live in constant sort of chaos and back and forth with Israel. And the same goes for Israelis. Like, who wants to be living in fear, right? Like, nobody does.
Mhm.
So it's just it's tough that there's this ongoing perception that, oh, it's absolutely the other side that doesn't want this. And I think that until we can find a way to sort of not amplify the loudest voices on either extremes, it's unfortunately going to kind of continue this way.
Okay, I have one more comment, and you tell me if you think this is fair or if there's some nuance there. This isn't really an equal fight between two nation states. It's not necessarily the Israeli people versus the Palestinian people. It's really Israel versus Hamas, who controls the Gaza Strip where the Palestinians live. And I believe that the Palestinians have really been a pawn in this fight. And so to say that you're pro Israel doesn't mean you're necessarily anti Palestinian. Do you concur with that, or do you think that that's
I
too
abs-
Pollyanna opinion?
I absolutely concur with that. I think that the issue is that every time that conflict like this happens, that it's sort of like it heightens everyone's senses, and people all of a sudden they make assumptions. This is what I heard. I mentioned that last week I was sort of at this presentation by some Israeli professors. They were saying that, like, on a person to person level, right, if they live in a neighborhood where they have Arab Israeli neighbors, or one woman who is Arab Israeli, she was saying, she's like, my neighbors, I live in like a very mixed neighborhood, and my neighbors who I know who are Israeli, like, we don't have problems. Like, we get along great. But then, and she's also a sociologist, so it like helps. And she's like, but then you zoom out, and when people don't personally know one another, things start to get difficult, right? They make assumptions. And you see that here too, right? And I heard someone say that, part of what we've seen with a lot of American Jews who've turned inward or turned to the right, or um, I mean that specifically on Israel, become more hawkish, et cetera, is out of a sense of fear and out of a sense of security, and that we need to be able to distinguish between things that make us uncomfortable and things that are actually a threat to our security, right?
Hmm.
So, someone waving a Palestinian flag might make you uncomfortable, but that's not inherently a threat to your security as a Jewish American, right? And I think that that's some of the things that people are struggling with, is like not really being able to feel like they can name that, or
'Cause there's just that gut reaction of, "Are you with me or against me?"
there's that gut reaction of, are you with me or are you against me? And there's also, people are not speaking the same language, right? And
Mhm.
like, when Zionist or anti-Zionist or, sloganeering, like from the river to the sea, when these things mean totally different things to totally different people, then they mean, when things mean everything, then they mean nothing, right? And so, people are not, they're not speaking to each other in a way that makes sense. And are there people on both sides who are not good faith actors? Yes. Are there people on both sides who are, cheering on death of innocents? Yes. Is that horrible? 100%. But do I think that the vast majority of people think that that's horrible? I do.
Mhm. Well, again, that this is goes to the whole heart of why we have these conversations, because
Right.
we recognize the damage of it. But that's all I have on this topic. You got anything else? Or do you think people are tired of hearing us
Oh,
talk?
nah, probably. Probably. Yeah. We'll leave it at that.
Perfect.